The rain did not merely fall from the sky on that bleak Tuesday evening. It descended as a calculated assault of freezing water, maintaining a cruel and unyielding temperature of exactly 34.2 degrees Fahrenheit, just a fraction above freezing, striking the earth with a percussive violence that systematically turned the sprawling, meticulously manicured grounds of the Silverbridge estate into a treacherous, suffocating ocean of thick, gelatinous mud. For precisely 7,305 days, which equated to exactly 20 years to the agonizing hour, Count Edmund had been entirely erased from the annals of high society, presumed utterly and unequivocally dead in a brutal foreign massacre that had claimed the lives of his entire regiment, his aristocratic name prematurely carved into a cenotaph of cold, unfeeling marble in the capital city, while his breathing, suffering body endured a sequence of unspeakable horrors that systematically stripped away every superficial veneer of his privileged upbringing and replaced it with a bedrock of cold, absolute, and unforgiving logic. He was no longer the naive, trusting young lord who had inherited a vast fortune of £3 million and an estate spanning 14,000 acres. He was a phantom, a living spectre wrapped in 22 pounds of sodden, foul-smelling rags that clung desperately to his emaciated frame, his bare, calloused feet sinking exactly 4.3 inches into the freezing muck with every agonizing, calculated step he took toward the towering granite walls of his ancestral home. The Silverbridge estate, a sprawling architectural monolith designed by the eccentric architect Sir Reginald Vance in the year 1642, boasted exactly 114 rooms, 3 miles of winding, immaculate cobblestone driveways, and a towering central spire that scraped the miserable grey sky at exactly 185 feet, a towering monument to generational wealth that now stood as a rotting, festering symbol of the exact moral decay Count Edmund had dedicated his reborn life to exposing. Every single one of the 412 precisely cut granite blocks that formed the East Wing's foundation had been paid for in blood and exploitation, a historical fact that Edmund had agonizingly meditated upon during his 3 years in a subterranean, lightless cell in the deep Orient, where the exact dimensions of his confinement had been a maddening 6 feet by 4 feet, mirroring the exact suffocating proportions of the alcove he was destined to discover. His survival during those 1,095 days of absolute darkness and routine, methodical torture had required a complete, brutal rewiring of his neurochemistry, forcing his brain to detach entirely from the emotional, empathetic responses of a normal human being, replacing terror and despair with a cold, terrifyingly hyper-vigilant logical framework that calculated the exact probability of every single outcome down to the 4th decimal point. It was this exact, robotic, psychological detachment that had allowed him to survive the bayonet thrust that had pierced exactly 4.7 inches into his left ribcage, narrowly missing his descending aorta by a miraculous 0.2 inches. A horrific, jagged scar that now throbbed with a dull, phantom ache in the 34-degree rain. A constant, physical reminder of the profound betrayal of his own commanding officer, who had intentionally ordered his regiment into the lethal ambush to eliminate Edmund and claim a fraction of his staggering wealth. Upon finally escaping his captors by strangling a guard with a chain forged of exact half-inch iron links, taking exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds for the man to expire, Edmund had not returned to England to reclaim his title and his £3 million. Instead, He had embarked on a brutal voluntary pilgrimage across the underbelly of human civilization, adopting the name Elias and the persona of a broken, mute beggar, deliberately subjecting himself to the absolute worst cruelty humanity had to offer in order to definitively prove his newly forged cynical hypothesis that human altruism was a complete, fabricated myth, and that every single human being, regardless of social class, would inevitably choose self-preservation, greed, or cruelty when presented with absolute power over a vulnerable subject. He had meticulously logged the results of this obsessive psychological experiment in a small, waterproof, leather-bound journal hidden deep within his tattered rags, recording exactly 312 separate interactions over the past year, resulting in precisely 312 failures of human decency, from wealthy merchants in Paris who had kicked him out of their path, to destitute thieves in London who had stolen his wooden crutch, proving his thesis with a terrifying absolute statistical perfection that had left his soul a barren, frozen wasteland. The wind howled across the moors at an unforgiving 43 miles per hour, slicing ruthlessly through the thin, threadbare cotton of his elaborate disguise, chilling his internal core temperature down to a highly dangerous 95.2 degrees, a terrifying physiological precursor to the deadly, creeping embrace of hypothermia. Yet his mind remained as sharp and unyielding as a finely honed surgical scalpel, perpetually dissecting the true, unvarnished nature of humanity with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing microbes under a lens. And so, dragging his simulated broken leg through the viscous, freezing mud of his own driveway, approaching the very doors he technically owned, he had fully expected the brutal, sneering rejection of Thomas the footman and Mrs. Higgins, anticipating their exact words and their exact microscopic expressions of disgust with the predictive accuracy of a mathematical equation, finding a dark, bitter satisfaction in the complete, utter confirmation of his staff's deep-seated corruption, until the exact moment Clara shattered his perfect statistical model. He methodically dragged his right leg, perfectly simulating a catastrophic, crippling injury to the femur and patella that he had practiced and perfected over the past 314 consecutive days of his arduous journey, leaning heavily on a splintered, rotting wooden crutch that groaned under his deliberately awkward weight distribution. His piercing, slate-grey eyes hidden safely beneath the matted, filthy, lice-infested tangle of his overgrown dark hair, silently scanning the imposing facade of the servants' quarters, noting with the precise eye of an owner that the mortar between the bricks on the 14th row of the east wing was beginning to crumble and would require exactly 40 pounds of fresh lime to repair, a seemingly trivial detail he catalogued with deep, detached precision, even as the freezing rain attempted to numb his cognitive functions. As he approached the heavy, brass-studded oak door of the servants' entrance, calculating the exact angle of his posture to maximize his appearance of pathetic vulnerability, his frozen, mud-caked knuckles rapped against the solid wood exactly 3 times, leaving dark, oily smudges on the freshly polished brass, the hollow, echoing thuds barely audible over the roaring, cacophonous symphony of the violent storm, yet just enough to penetrate the thick walls and summon the harsh, unforgiving, yellow light of an oil lantern swinging open on a rusted iron hinge to reveal the sneering, arrogant face of Thomas, the head footman, a man whose left eyebrow twitched with a microscopic involuntary spasm of profound, deeply ingrained disgust at the sight of the wretched, dripping figure shivering pitifully on the pristine stone threshold. "What in God's name do you want, you filthy, disease-ridden vermin?" Thomas snarled viciously, his voice a jagged, abrasive edge of pure contempt that resonated with the practiced cruelty of a petty tyrant who profoundly enjoyed inflicting psychological and physical pain on those he deemed infinitely beneath his own elevated station, simultaneously kicking his heavy, meticulously polished leather riding boot forward with exactly 20 pounds of forceful momentum to strike the base of the beggar's fragile crutch, intentionally causing Edmund to lose his precariously calculated balance and collapse violently backward into the freezing, gelatinous mud, his left shoulder hitting the ground with a sickening, audible thud that sent a spike of genuine, white-hot pain shooting rapidly up his cervical spine, though his facial expression remained instantly and perfectly locked in a mask of pathetic, trembling subservience, betraying absolutely none of the lethal aristocratic fury boiling within his chest. "Get that disgusting creature away from our clean doors before I set the hunting hounds on you to tear you to absolute shreds, you diseased, flea-bitten rat," echoed the shrill, ear-piercing, mocking voice of Mrs. Higgins, the head housekeeper, who stood imposingly behind Thomas in the warm, dry corridor, her thick arms folded tightly across her ample chest, her thin, cruel lips curled into an ugly sneer that proudly exposed exactly 3 expensive gold-capped teeth, her dark, beady eyes gleaming with a sadistic, twisted satisfaction as she sadistically watched the old, helpless beggar desperately struggle to push his freezing, aching body up from the suffocating mud, his numb, frozen fingers helplessly slipping and sliding in the thick brown sludge, unable to find purchase. It was in this precise, terrifying moment of manufactured, agonizing degradation, exactly 14.6 seconds after he had been brutally thrown into the mud by his own employee, that Clara quietly emerged from the oppressive shadows of the subterranean scullery, her small, frail, undernourished frame shivering uncontrollably in a thin, threadbare, coarse linen dress that offered mathematically zero protection against the penetrating icy cold of the open doorway. Her small hands raw, red, and covered in exactly 17 distinct blisters, from relentlessly scrubbing the harsh, uneven stone floors of the kitchens with lye soap for 14 excruciating, uninterrupted hours that very day. Her large, expressive brown eyes widening in absolute horror as they locked instantly onto the trembling, defeated figure of the fallen beggar, gasping in the freezing rain. "Stop it this instant, please. He is literally freezing to death out there," Clara pleaded desperately, her voice trembling not primarily from the biting cold, but from a terrifying, unprecedented surge of absolute defiance against her cruel superiors, a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated, overwhelming empathy softening the exhausted corners of her chapped mouth and brilliantly illuminating her dark, sleep-deprived eyes as she forcefully pushed her small body past the imposing, muscular bulk of Thomas, entirely and recklessly disregarding the severe, inevitable social and physical consequences of her insubordinate actions. Her bare, bruised knees sinking deeply into the freezing mud as she immediately knelt beside the disguised, silently observing Count, her small, surprisingly warm hands gripping his freezing, mud-caked shoulders with a desperate, frantic, almost maternal strength that defied her tiny physical stature. "You foolish, insolent, incredibly stupid girl, leave that foul piece of street trash exactly where it belongs, or I swear to God you will be sleeping out in the mud with him tonight without a blanket, Mrs." Higgins shrieked violently, her voice cracking with pure authoritarian fury, a vein violently throbbing on the left side of her thick neck. But Clara did not even flinch a single millimeter, her complete, undivided psychological focus narrowed entirely and exclusively on the urgent preservation of a suffering human life, a profound, staggering demonstration of the unconditional, selfless goodness that Edmund had spent the last 20 agonizing years of his life desperately searching the globe for, finally finding it in the lowest, most invisible servant of his own corrupted household. "Come with me right now," "I promise I will not let you die here in the cold," Clara whispered urgently, her soft, reassuring words woven directly and intimately into the deafening cacophony of the raging storm, functioning as a sacred, unbreakable secret vow of absolute salvation. As she carefully slipped her slender, bruised left arm under his sodden right armpit, straining every underdeveloped, aching muscle in her fragile back to slowly haul his heavy, dead weight upward from the suction of the mud, completely ignoring the icy rain that aggressively lashed against her pale face and soaked her thin dress to the bone, half carrying and half dragging him exactly 17 agonizing, slippery steps toward the hidden, entirely forgotten architectural alcove situated beneath the heavy stone staircase of the deepest root cellar, an anomalous, cramped space that measured a suffocatingly small 4 feet by exactly 6 feet, a dark, damp, freezing sanctuary she had quietly claimed as her only safe harbor in the immensely hostile, predatory ecosystem of the Silverbridge estate. The journey down those 17 steps took exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds of grueling, exhausting effort, each step jarring Edmund's disguised frame while Clara breathed heavily, her lung capacity severely compromised by years of breathing in the coal dust of the scullery, yet she never once loosened her iron grip on his tattered coat, her sheer willpower driving them both down into the pitch-black abyss of the cellar, away from the cruel, mocking laughter of Thomas and Mrs. Higgins that slowly faded into the ambient roar of the tempest above. As they finally crossed the threshold into the tiny, hidden alcove, the immediate cessation of the biting wind felt like a physical weight being lifted, the ambient temperature in the cramped space hovering exactly at 48 degrees Fahrenheit, a full 14 degrees warmer than the lethal storm outside, though still cold enough to cause severe, prolonged shivering. But to Clara, this miserable, damp hole in the wall was a sacred temple of safety, and as she gently lowered the disguised Count onto a thin, mouldy pile of discarded burlap sacks that served as her only mattress, Edmund's sharp, calculating mind registered every microscopic detail of her actions, realizing with absolute, terrifying clarity that this invisible, utterly powerless scullery maid possessed a purity of soul that was entirely extinct among the wealthy aristocratic circles he had once belonged to, setting into motion the first precise calculations of a grand, devastating master plan that would soon completely tear the rigid, deeply corrupted hierarchy of the Silverbridge estate entirely apart, brick by exact brick. In the suffocating, pitch-black darkness of the forgotten alcove, measuring exactly 4 feet in width by exactly 6 feet in length, with a claustrophobically low ceiling height of exactly 5 feet and 2 inches that forced even Clara to stoop slightly, Count Edmund lay completely motionless on the damp, smelling burlap sacks, his highly trained senses rapidly adjusting to the sensory deprivation of the underground space, meticulously analyzing every microscopic sound, smell, and temperature fluctuation within his immediate environment. The profound silence of the alcove, broken only by the microscopic rhythmic dripping of condensation falling exactly once every 4.2 seconds from the low stone ceiling into a dark, stagnant puddle in the corner, provided the perfect acoustic environment for Edmund to continue his hyper-detailed, forensic psychological analysis of the young woman sitting on her knees exactly 14 inches away from his chest. Clara, he deduced from the exact pattern of calluses on her small hands and the specific stooped curvature of her thoracic spine, was no older than 19 years of age, meaning she had been born entirely within the time frame of his 20-year absence, a child of the lower classes who had likely been sold into the harsh indentured servitude of the Silverbridge estate to pay off a staggering, insurmountable family debt, a predatory practice he knew his corrupt estate manager, Mr. Carson, utilized to secure essentially free, expendable labor for the massive property, Her breathing, which he measured carefully at 22 breaths per minute, was shallow and mildly labored, indicating an early, undiagnosed onset of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, a direct, horrific consequence of spending 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, inhaling the toxic, microscopic particulate matter of the kitchen's massive, cast-iron coal stoves without the slightest form of respiratory protection, a condition that would mathematically reduce her natural life expectancy by exactly 25 years if she remained in this subterranean hell. Yet, despite the immense, crushing weight of this structural, inescapable suffering, her large, expressive brown eyes contained absolutely zero trace of the hollow, deadened apathy he had observed in exactly 94% of the destitute labourers he had encountered across Europe. Instead, her eyes burned with a quiet, fierce, incredibly resilient dignity, a microscopic, deeply internalized light of pure humanity that the Silverbridge estate's cruelty had miraculously failed to extinguish. The heavy, unmistakable scent of rotting root vegetables, damp limestone, and stale, unwashed fabric permeated the stagnant air. Yet cutting through this olfactory misery was the faint, unexpected scent of cheap lye soap and crushed lavender emanating from Clara's raw, blistered hands as she frantically moved about the tiny space in the total darkness, her movements precise and practiced, revealing that she had navigated this exact 6-by-4-foot perimeter hundreds, perhaps thousands of times before. Edmund slowed his heart rate to exactly 52 beats per minute, a meditative physiological control technique he had mastered during his 3 years imprisoned in a subterranean cell in the Orient, allowing his core body temperature to slowly stabilize as he continued to feign unconsciousness, his eyelids slitted open exactly 2 millimeters, to observe the faint, ghostly outline of the scullery maid as she struck a single, precious sulphur match. The sudden brilliant flare of yellow light illuminating her exhausted, soot-stained face for exactly 4 seconds before she carefully transferred the flame to the wicked stub of a stolen tallow candle that measured merely 2.5 inches tall. The flickering pale orange light cast long, dancing, grotesque shadows against the weeping, moisture-streaked stone walls, revealing the profound, heartbreaking extent of Clara's absolute poverty, her private sanctuary containing absolutely nothing but the burlap pile, a single chipped wooden crate functioning as a makeshift table, and a small, rusted tin box containing her entire worldly possessions, an inventory that Edmund's photographic memory instantly logged and analyzed with brutal, logical efficiency. "Please, you must wake up, you are freezing," Clara whispered softly, her voice barely registering above 20 decibels, a tone carefully modulated to avoid detection by the cruel household staff above, as she knelt beside him, her damp, shivering knees pressing into the cold stone floor, her hands quickly but gently unbuttoning the thickest, most sodden layer of his ruined, mud-caked overcoat, stripping the freezing, waterlogged 22 pounds of fabric away from his torso to prevent further heat loss, entirely unaware that beneath the filthy rags she was exposing the heavily scarred, heavily muscled, and impeccably maintained physique of a lethal aristocratic warrior. He allowed a low, pathetic, rattling groan to escape his lips, perfectly simulating the painful, disorienting return to consciousness of a dying man, his eyes fluttering open to lock onto her deeply concerned, empathetic brown eyes, noting instantly the exact depth of the dark, bruised circles under her lower eyelids, which measured precisely 1/4 of an inch thick, a glaring, undeniable medical symptom of severe, chronic sleep deprivation and acute malnutrition that immediately triggered a cold, calculated surge of protective fury deep within his chest. "I have something for you to eat. It is not much, but it will help warm your stomach," she murmured gently, her words flowing continuously into the narrative of the night without the slightest hesitation, reaching into her deep, hidden apron pocket to retrieve a small, tightly wrapped piece of stained linen, carefully unfolding it to reveal exactly 2.4 ounces of stale, hardened, dark rye bread, a pathetic, mold-spotted crust that represented her entire daily caloric allotment, alongside a cracked, thoroughly chipped porcelain mug containing exactly 4.5 ounces of tepid, heavily watered-down chicken broth she had secretly siphoned from the kitchen's waste bucket. Edmund stared at the meager, pathetic offering, his brilliant, hyper-analytical mind instantly calculating the exact nutritional value of the food, knowing with absolute unshakable certainty that by giving him this food, Clara was deliberately and knowingly choosing to starve herself for the next 24 hours, subjecting her already frail, 98-pound body to agonizing hunger pangs and severe weakness, simply to comfort a stranger she believed to be entirely worthless to society. "Eat it slowly. The broth is mostly water, but it has salt," Clara instructed gently, her micro-expressions completely devoid of any resentment or hesitation, her face radiating a pure, concentrated glow of absolute altruism as she pressed the cracked rim of the porcelain mug against his chapped, cracked lips, carefully tilting it to allow the salty, lukewarm liquid to flow over his tongue, the simple, metallic taste of the broth overwhelming his senses, not because of its culinary quality, but because of the profound, staggering psychological weight of the sacrifice it represented. He swallowed exactly 3 mouthfuls of the broth, letting the liquid slide down his throat, before his gaze shifted to the hardened crust of rye bread she was breaking into incredibly tiny, manageable pieces with her blistered fingers, placing a small crumb onto his palm, with the reverence of a priest administering a holy sacrament, her touch sending a completely unexpected, microscopic jolt of static electricity across his skin, a physical reaction he catalogued alongside the rapidly accumulating data regarding her extraordinary moral character. As he slowly chewed the hard, unforgiving bread, feigning weakness, Edmund's exceptionally sharp hearing picked up the faint, rhythmic, muffled vibrations of heavy footsteps echoing through the thick stone ceiling directly above them. Exactly 3 pairs of boots marching across the kitchen floorboards, their heavy treads matching the precise gait patterns of Thomas the footman, Gregory the under-butler, and Mr. Carson the estate manager, their voices heavily muffled but perfectly decipherable to a man who had spent years listening to the hushed whispers of enemy guards through solid iron doors. "Have you secured the 3 crates of the vintage Bordeaux from the lower cellars yet, Thomas? Because the buyer in London is expecting the shipment by Thursday, and we stand to make exactly £450 from this batch alone." Carson's deep, arrogant voice drifted down through the floorboards, the exact financial figures and specific criminal details weaving seamlessly into the acoustic environment of the alcove, providing Edmund with the precise, undeniable, and utterly damning evidence of the massive, systematic embezzlement ring his trusted staff had been operating during his 20-year absence. "They are packed and hidden in the grain silos, Mr. Carson, completely untraceable, and with the old Count dead and rotting in some foreign ditch for 20 years, and his distant cousin too drunk to ever audit the estate ledgers, this place is essentially ours to strip bare," Thomas replied with a cold, sneering laugh that vibrated violently through the ancient floor joists, an auditory manifestation of pure, unadulterated, aristocratic rot and lower-class corruption, perfectly mirroring each other in a grotesque symphony of greed that Edmund listened to with absolute chilling calm. The staggering contrast between the massive, arrogant theft of hundreds of pounds of fine wine occurring exactly 12 feet above his head, and the pure, heartbreaking, self-sacrificial offering of a 2-ounce crust of stale bread occurring directly in front of him, crystallized his complex, long-gestating philosophical theories into one undeniable absolute truth. The entire hierarchy of the Silverbridge estate was completely and fundamentally inverted. The supposed nobility acting as predatory parasites, while the lowest, most discarded servant possessed the true, noble heart of a sovereign. The Silverbridge estate was not merely a house. It was a massive, highly complex socio-economic machine generating roughly £45,000 in annual revenue from its extensive tenant farms, wool production and timber exports, all of which was currently being actively and systematically looted by the very staff entrusted to protect it. A fact confirmed by the exact, undeniable confession of embezzlement he had just recorded in his photographic memory from the floorboards above. He calculated that in order to execute a perfect, devastating, and entirely inescapable trap for Thomas, Mrs. Higgins, Mr. Carson, and the rest of the corrupt aristocratic parasites currently bleeding his ancestral home dry, he would need exactly 72 hours of uninterrupted covert observation from the safety of this hidden 4-by-6-foot alcove, gathering the exact dates, times, and financial figures of their crimes, compiling an airtight, irrefutable mental ledger of their absolute guilt. To achieve this, he would need to rely entirely on Clara, depending on this starving, completely powerless scullery maid to provide him with the minimal, necessary caloric intake to sustain his vital functions without triggering the suspicion of the head housekeeper, a delicate, highly dangerous logistical operation that would place her in extreme, constant physical jeopardy. An absolute moral dilemma that caused a strange, unfamiliar, and deeply unsettling tightness in his chest. A sensation he clinically identified as genuine, unadulterated guilt, an emotion he had not felt in exactly 20 years. He resolved, in the suffocating darkness of that freezing hole, that every single ounce of pain Clara endured over the next 3 days, every single harsh word spoken to her by Mrs. Higgins, every single microscopic callus forming on her raw hands, would be meticulously recorded in his mind and added to the rapidly expanding astronomical debt he intended to exact upon the household staff, a debt he would collect with terrifying, absolute and unmerciful precision, utilizing the full, unchecked legal and financial power of the Count of Silverbridge. Clara, entirely oblivious to the monumental, life-altering revelations occurring within the silent, disguised man lying before her, simply smiled, a small, weary, but incredibly beautiful micro-expression that briefly erased the heavy, agonizing lines of exhaustion from her young face, gently taking the empty, cracked mug from his hands and using a relatively dry corner of her coarse linen apron to wipe a small streak of mud from his freezing cheek, an act of intimate, completely unnecessary tenderness that struck Edmund with the force of a physical blow to the sternum. "You rest now," she whispered, pulling the edges of the filthy, damp rags tighter around his shoulders to conserve his body heat, her voice a soothing, rhythmic metronome in the suffocating dark. "I have to go back upstairs before Mrs. Higgins notices I'm gone and docks my wages for the week, which is exactly 3 shillings, but I will come back down here at exactly midnight with more coal for the brazier. Just promise me you will stay hidden and quiet. They are cruel people, and they will hurt you if they find you." Edmund did not speak. He merely offered a slow, weak nod of his head, maintaining his absolute commitment to his elaborate physical deception. But as Clara turned her back and quietly slipped out of the 4-by-6 alcove, ascending the 17 stone steps back into the brutal, unforgiving world of the kitchen, Count Edmund's slate-grey eyes hardened into cold, impenetrable diamonds in the darkness, his mind instantly initiating the complex, multi-tiered, hyperlogical strategic calculations required to completely dismantle the corrupt power structure of his own estate, exactly 24 minutes and 3 seconds after he had been thrown into the mud, knowing with absolute unshakable certainty that when he finally revealed his true, terrifying identity and reclaimed his ancestral power, the invisible, starving scullery maid who had just saved his life with a crust of bread would stand beside him, not as a servant, but as the uncontested, wildly powerful Countess of Silverbridge, an exact, perfect and deeply satisfying reversal of the cruel, unforgiving social hierarchy that had defined and tormented both of their tragically intersecting lives for the past 7,305 days. For the next exactly 72 hours, the microscopic dark alcove served as the psychological crucible where Count Edmund meticulously forged the instruments of his absolute vengeance, a silent, subterranean war room measuring a pathetic 24 square feet, where the only currency was patience and the only casualty was Clara's rapidly deteriorating physical health. At precisely 6:30 every morning, an hour before the first rays of the miserable grey sun breached the high, dirt-caked windows of the upper scullery, Clara would silently descend the 17 stone steps, her breathing audibly shallower, carrying exactly 1.8 ounces of stolen bread and 3 ounces of tepid water, her left cheek bearing a rapidly darkening purplish-blue contusion, measuring exactly 2.5 inches across, a brutal, undeniable testament to the physical violence Mrs. Higgins had inflicted upon her the previous evening for a fabricated infraction regarding a missing sliver of lye soap. Edmund had heard the strike, the sickening wet slap of a heavy wooden cane against human flesh, echoing down the ventilation shafts at exactly 9:47 p.m., followed by Clara's muffled, choked gasp, a sound that had caused his resting heart rate to violently spike from 52 to 114 beats per minute, his heavily scarred muscles instinctively tensing to launch him out of the darkness to tear the housekeeper's throat out. A lethal impulse he suppressed only through the absolute terrifying discipline forged in a lightless oriental cell. When Clara had finally arrived in the alcove that night, bleeding from a minor laceration on her lower lip, she had simply smiled, a heartbreaking, fragile micro-expression that defied the sheer brutality of her existence, and offered him a tiny, bruised apple she had salvaged from the waste bin, whispering that he must eat it to keep his strength up, entirely oblivious to the fact that she was currently sustaining the life of a man who owned the very ground she bled upon. During the deepest, most silent hours of the night, specifically between 2:15 and 3:30 a.m., when the entire corrupt staff of the Silverbridge estate fell into a drunken, gluttonous stupor fueled by stolen wine, Edmund would silently leave the alcove, moving with the terrifying, silent precision of an apex predator, ascending the 17 stone steps and bypassing the squeaking 13th floorboard with surgical accuracy to infiltrate the upper, locked echelons of his own home. He navigated the labyrinthine, pitch-black corridors of the East Wing entirely by memory, taking exactly 42 paces from the scullery door to the heavy oak entrance of the estate manager's private study, utilizing a small, customized iron wire he had meticulously fashioned from the buckle of his beggar's rags to flawlessly pick the complex brass tumbler of the lock in precisely 14 seconds. Once inside the opulent mahogany-panelled room, which reeked of expensive Cuban cigars and stolen French brandy, he bypassed the superficial ledgers left on the desk and immediately approached the grand, oil-painted portrait of his own grandfather, pressing his thumb exactly 2 inches below the gilded frame to trigger a hidden spring-loaded mechanism that he alone knew existed, revealing a small, steel-lined wall, safe, containing the true, unredacted financial records of the estate. Over 3 consecutive nights, relying entirely on the faint, ambient moonlight filtering through the heavy velvet drapes, Edmund mathematically processed exactly 412 pages of deeply incriminating financial documents, his photographic memory permanently recording exactly £17,420 of embezzled funds, 32 illegal land transfers, and a staggering array of forged signatures that systematically implicated Mr. Carson, Thomas, and Mrs. Higgins in a massive, highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. He left absolutely zero physical trace of his infiltration, returning the documents to their exact millimeter-precise positions within the safe, relocking the study door, and slipping back down into the freezing, damp alcove just minutes before Clara would arrive with her morning offering of crumbs. His mind now armed with a lethal, airtight and completely inescapable legal and financial guillotine suspended perfectly over the necks of his tormentors. The psychological contrast between the massive, opulent wealth he was secretly auditing upstairs and the agonizing, slow starvation occurring within the 4-by-6-foot alcove was pushing his highly controlled emotions to an absolute breaking point, particularly when he noted that Clara's body weight had visibly dropped by at least 2 pounds in merely 3 days. Her collarbones protruding sharply against the thin, coarse linen of her dress, her hands trembling so violently from caloric deficit that she could barely hold the cracked porcelain mug steady. Yet her spirit remained completely, terrifyingly unbroken, her empathy expanding to fill the suffocating space, engaging him in whispered, one-sided conversations about her late father, a simple, honest tenant farmer who had died owing the estate exactly £42, a debt that the cruel Mr. Carson had immediately transferred to his teenage daughter, effectively enslaving her to the Silverbridge kitchens until the end of her natural life. She spoke without anger, without resentment, weaving her tragic narrative directly into the damp air of the cellar, stating simply that the world was hard, but that one must not let the hardness enter their heart. A profound, staggering piece of philosophical wisdom delivered by a starving, abused girl in a freezing hole. A statement that struck the heavily scarred, hyperlogical Count with the devastating force of an artillery shell. On the morning of the 4th day, precisely 96 hours after he had been thrown into the mud, Edmund knew the absolute maximum threshold of his intelligence gathering had been reached, and more importantly, he knew with agonizing certainty that Clara's physical body could not survive another 48 hours of this extreme, self-imposed starvation. The grand, sprawling Silverbridge estate was scheduled to host a massive, highly exclusive dinner party that very evening, an event organized by Mr. Carson to illegally entertain exactly 34 wealthy, corrupt local aristocrats and potential buyers of the stolen estate assets, a gathering that presented the absolute, mathematically perfect environment for a catastrophic, public, and inescapable revelation of power. As Clara handed him exactly 1.2 ounces of bread that morning, her eyes heavy with profound exhaustion, Edmund gently reached out and caught her small, blistered, trembling hand in his own, his grip surprisingly firm, warm, and completely devoid of the weakness he had been feigning. A sudden, jarring shift in physical reality that caused Clara's eyes to widen in genuine surprise, her pulse visibly fluttering at exactly 88 beats per minute in the hollow of her pale throat. "Do not come down to this alcove tonight, Clara," he commanded softly, his voice dropping the pathetic, rattling rasp of a dying beggar and assuming the deep, resonant and unmistakably aristocratic baritone of Count Edmund of Silverbridge. A voice accustomed to commanding regiments of men in the heat of battle, a voice that vibrated powerfully through the damp, stagnant air of the cellar. "Tonight, when the clock in the Grand Hall strikes exactly 8 p.m., you are to walk directly through the main oak doors of the grand dining room. Regardless of who tries to stop you, regardless of what Mrs. Higgins threatens, you must walk through those doors and you must look for me," he instructed, his slate-grey eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying, absolute intensity that paralyzed her with a mixture of fear and profound confusion. before he finally released her hand, leaving her to ascend the 17 stone steps in a state of deep psychological shock, unaware that the foundations of her agonizing world were about to be completely and violently obliterated. The grand dining hall of the Silverbridge estate, an architectural masterpiece measuring exactly 80 feet long and 40 feet wide, was ablaze with the light of exactly 412 beeswax candles suspended in 3 massive cascading crystal chandeliers, the warm, golden illumination reflecting brilliantly off the polished mahogany table, set for exactly 34 corrupt, arrogant guests who were currently laughing, drinking stolen vintage Bordeaux, and carelessly dining on roasted pheasant and imported truffles. At precisely 7:58 p.m., Mr. Carson, the bloated, immensely arrogant estate manager, stood at the head of the table, his crystal goblet raised high, his face flushed red with the intoxicating, arrogant thrill of absolute, unchecked power, preparing to deliver a highly boastful, utterly fraudulent speech regarding the continued, prosperous stewardship of the Silverbridge lands in the tragic, deeply unfortunate absence of the late Count Edmund. A speech he had delivered with sickening, practiced sincerity dozens of times over the past 20 years. Outside the massive, heavily carved double oak doors of the dining hall, guarded by Thomas the footman who stood in his pristine, gold-braided livery, a sudden, heavy, and completely anomalous silence descended upon the grand corridor, an atmospheric pressure drop that occurred exactly 42 seconds before the heavy oak doors were violently, explosively shoved open with a concussive force that shattered the iron hinges, the massive slabs of wood slamming backward into the stone walls with a deafening crack that instantly silenced the entire room. Standing perfectly framed in the grand entryway was not the filthy, broken, pathetic beggar who had been thrown into the mud exactly 96 hours prior, but a terrifying, towering figure of absolute lethal authority, Count Edmund of Silverbridge, having completely stripped away his sodden rags to reveal the pristine, heavily tailored, pitch-black military uniform of his former regiment he had retrieved from a sealed cedar chest in the west wing, the fabric perfectly clinging to his heavily muscled, deeply scarred physique, his overgrown dark hair pulled tightly back to reveal a face carved from unforgiving cold granite. On the index finger of his right hand, resting casually but deliberately on the silver pommel of a cavalry sabre strapped to his waist, gleamed the massive, undeniable, deep black onyx signet ring of the Silverbridge bloodline, a ring measuring exactly 1.2 inches in diameter, bearing the ancient crest of a roaring silver lion, an absolute irrefutable symbol of maximum aristocratic authority that immediately caused the blood to completely and instantaneously drain from Mr. Carson's bloated face, turning his complexion a sickly, chalky white. "Good evening, Carson. I trust you have found the vintage Bordeaux from the lower cellars to your exact liking, considering you fully intended to sell the remaining 3 crates to a buyer in London by Thursday for exactly £450, Edmund stated, his deep, resonant voice slicing through the absolute, terrified silence of the grand hall like a freshly sharpened executioner's axe, a hyper-specific, utterly damning revelation of highly classified criminal knowledge that caused Carson's glass goblet to slip from his trembling, sweaty fingers and shatter violently against the marble floor, scattering exactly 3 ounces of red wine like a splatter of fresh blood. The ensuing chaos was instantaneous and absolute, as Thomas the footman instinctively lunged forward, completely forgetting the strict protocols of his station in a blind, animalistic panic, only to be met with a terrifying, blindingly fast physical counterattack, as Edmund smoothly drew his sabre exactly 3 inches from its scabbard and drove the heavy silver pommel directly into the center of Thomas's chest with exactly 80 pounds of blunt force, collapsing the footman to the marble floor in a gasping gasping, agonizing heap, his ribcage severely bruised, while Mrs. Higgins, standing paralyzed near the serving carts, let out a high-pitched, pathetic whimper of pure, unadulterated terror. "You have exactly 20 minutes to contact the local magistrate, Carson, and you will present to him the forged documents hidden within the secondary steel safe in my grandfather's portrait, detailing the exact theft of £17,420 over the past 20 years, Edmund commanded, his voice devoid of any shouting, possessing instead a cold, terrifying sub-zero calmness that paralyzed the entire room of 34 wealthy guests, who were now staring in absolute silent horror at the literal resurrection of the man they had assumed dead for 7,305 days. It was at this exact moment, as the grand clock in the corner of the hall struck the first heavy, booming chime of 8 p.m., that the massive oak doors creaked open once more, and Clara stepped hesitantly into the brilliant, blinding light of the chandeliers, her frail 98-pound frame trembling violently in her coarse, threadbare scullery dress, her dark eyes wide with terror and confusion, her left cheek still bearing the horrific purple-blue contusion inflicted by the head housekeeper. Mrs. Higgins instinctively moved to intercept her, snarling a vicious command for the filthy kitchen rat to get out, but a single, lethal, micro-expression of pure, unchecked fury from Edmund, accompanied by a terrifying half-step in her direction, froze the housekeeper entirely, her pathetic bravado completely dissolving under the gaze of a man who had survived tortures she could not even theoretically comprehend. Edmund walked slowly, deliberately, exactly 22 paces across the polished marble floor, completely ignoring the 34 wealthy, powerful aristocrats who were holding their breath in absolute terror, bypassing the hyperventilating, broken estate manager, until he stood directly in front of the shivering, entirely invisible scullery maid who had saved his life with exactly 2.4 ounces of stale bread. He slowly dropped to one knee, lowering his towering, intimidating frame until he was at eye level with her, reaching out with his right hand to gently, reverently take her raw, blistered, lie-burned fingers into his own, the massive onyx signet ring cold against her skin, an act of extreme, public, and undeniable submission by the absolute highest power in the room to the absolute lowest. "Clara, the debt of £42 your father owed this corrupt estate is hereby mathematically and legally erased, and in its place the entire Silverbridge estate, including its 14,000 acres, its 114 rooms, and every single soul standing in this hall, now owes you an infinite unpayable debt for the preservation of my life," he declared, his voice echoing powerfully off the high, vaulted ceilings, permanently and irrevocably altering the trajectory of their lives. He stood up, gently pulling her fragile body up with him, wrapping his heavy, warm, pristine black military coat around her shivering shoulders, completely covering her threadbare rags, and turned to face the terrified, completely broken staff and the stunned, silent aristocrats, his eyes burning with a terrifying, absolute authority that would never again be questioned for the rest of his natural life. "You will refer to her from this exact second forward, not as Clara, not as a scullery maid, but as the Countess of Silverbridge, and anyone who looks at her with anything less than absolute, unyielding reverence will answer directly to the blade of my saber," he finalized, his words cementing the absolute perfect conclusion to a 20-year nightmare, elevating the invisible girl who had shown him the only true, unconditional altruism in the world to the highest pinnacle of power. As they stood together amidst the shattered ruins of a deeply corrupt hierarchy, finally ready to rebuild their world,